We are here at today's Ultimate Health and Wellness Expo here at Marketplace Mall, and we have a very special guest for you, which you've probably seen me promoting now for months and stalking people's Facebook pages and social media. We have actor, director, producer, all around pretty amazing guy, and we were very, very lucky to be able to get him to come up to little old Rochester today. But we have Mr. Daniel Baldwin that is coming on board right now.
Woo!
What you've all been waiting for today. And I wanted to take a second and not only thank him for the opportunity to have him here and be able to speak with us. I want to thank our sponsors. I would love to thank Robin, who you will be hearing coming after Daniel, who has an incredible story, and you've probably seen on the cover of our Central New York Woman Online.
Woo!
With my co-publisher, Miss Tammy Reese. But I definitely want to thank all of our amazing sponsors here today, for Marketplace Mall for letting us come out here and take over their entire mall for the day. And I hope you guys are all enjoying yourselves. And I am going to leave it to Daniel.
Thank you.
Woo!
I am not going to put my finger on any part of my body. I'm going to sit. As a service to my own sobriety, I place young men and women into recovery here in Central New York.
Woo!
What many of you know and many of you might not know is that heroin overdoses 10 years ago were not in the top 20 of causes of death in the United States. In the last decade, heroin overdoses and opiate overdoses are the #1 killer of Americans ages 50 and down. Not on the charts in the top 20 10 years ago, the #1 cause of death in our country. We will lose 75,000 men and women in the year 2020 to opiate overdoses, making it a more significant killer than the entire Vietnam War. We lost more kids in 2019 than the 58,000 veterans that we lost in the Vietnam War. Now, we're going around and calling this an epidemic. When Ebola came into Dallas International Airport, the federal government released $650 million in emergency funds because one case came into the United States for fear of what that chain reaction could have been. To date, not a single federal dollar has been spent to fight the opioid epidemic, which killed more people than the Vietnam War just last year. I can't quite figure out the math. One person got it, 650 million, 75,000 will die this year, not $1. So I can't figure out how it is we're managing this in Washington. I have been in contact with the task force that was set forth by President Trump. I think he's very concerned. He has named it epidemic, but we need dollars and cents to help these kids that really are falling under the following scenario is 95% of the times that I see it. Mom and dad had some kind of an injury, or the kid had an injury. And so unbeknownst to you, Robin's daughter went in and had some surgery done on her mouth, and they handed her 90 Vicodin, not 9 Vicodin, 90 Vicodin. What you don't realize is that after you've consumed your 90th Vicodin, you're already addicted to the medication. Pain is a natural indicator. After you have a surgery on your knee and you take some medication to get over the first few days, that pain that you feel is there to tell you you're doing too much. You're not supposed to be doing what you're doing. That's why they say, go do the rehabilitation, take it easy, stretch, blah. So if you want to feel nothing and start running wind sprints, sure, go get 90 Vicodin. You're going to damage the knee even worse, and you're going to get looped and hooked on this drug. So after you get hooked on the drug that's been prescribed to you, suddenly you can't get the prescription anymore because even the doctor has some kind of a conscience, and he maybe gives you a couple more refills and then you're done. Now you got to pay $20 to $50 a pill depending upon what you're taking. And how long do you expect a 20-year-old kid to take 10 pills a day at $20 a piece? That's a $200 a day habit that that child has. So you're missing jewelry and you're missing cash and checks are missing and the entire thing starts to slide. And suddenly when he can't keep the habit up anymore and he's sick, the same guy that sold him the pill takes out a little white bag. And he says, hey, bro, you can buy this bag for $25 and it'll last you all day long. Now he swears to God he's never going to shoot it. He's only going to do it, just for a little bit till he can get a little more money together, whatever his story is. And by the time I get him, he's sharing needles, he has Hep C or he has AIDS. And then the mother calls me and says, there's something terribly wrong with my child. And I have to take him in that condition and try to detox him, rehab him, and see what I can do about the multi-ailments that he has as a result of sharing needles. And this cycle is going on. It's happening right here in Rochester. It happens where I am in Syracuse. I can't tell you the number of times I've challenged the superintendents of schools and the principals when they say, well, that's really not happening at my high school. That's not happening. And I said, you don't think they're shooting heroin in your locker room? No, they're not shooting heroin in the locker room or in the bathrooms of my school. I said, great. I got a buddy that's with the ATF and he has the dog, supersonic nose. Let's get together with him on a Sunday when no one's in the school. And I'll let that dog sniff those lockers and I'll bet you whatever amount of money you want, if he doesn't poke his nose at point 25 times in your school, I'll eat the dog. Well, I wouldn't be allowed to do that because that's technically, I said, no one's going to be there but you, me, and the dog. And the guy that handles the dog. Because they don't want to know. They think they're doing you a service because you pay so much money in taxes in some of the more affluent areas. But it's happening at your best high schools and some of your inner city high schools, but it's happened at every single high school. And if we don't do something about it, as well as I'm known as a baby boomer, being born in the 1960s, you will refer to this generation as the heroin generation. It's getting that bad. So, what do we know that works? Mathematics is a science. It is not an opinion. Math does not lie or deviate from the truth. The system of going to rehab for 28 days was set by the United States Air Force when they realized in the Vietnam War that they were having trouble with some of their pilots drinking. They said, how many days are we allowed to put them on paid leave? And it was 28. And that became the standard to send you to a 28-day stay in rehab. For some reason, it had to do with their insurance and their leave, and that became the gold standard. Now, listen carefully to this statistic. Less than 3% of those people that go to rehab for 28 days stay sober for 1 year. Less than 3 out of 100. That's a system built on failure. No other job or no other occupation or no other store that you had that produced less than 3% at anything is a successful business. You're out of business in a month. If I told one of our prestigious doctors here that he had a success rate of less than 3% of the surgeries and the treatments that he does, who would go see him? That's anything. So now let's look at what happens when you stay in that controlled environment for 90 days. It goes up to almost 14%. And at 6 months, it goes up to 45%. And if you stay in a treatment program that has levels, detox, rehab, PHP, and then 7 months of sober living, those that complete that program for 1 year, 95% of them get multiple years of sobriety. Well, it's kind of a no-brainer. Who doesn't go for a year then? And how many times does it take you to recondition someone that has years of experience of doing things one way? I always take my hand and I put it out like this, and I say, this is the behavioral basket of your son or your daughter. Now I'm about to reach into that basket and pull out a majority of the things that they do in their everyday life that they can't do anymore because they won't stay sober if they do. If you don't replace things for them to do that are healthy in that basket, they're going to go right back to doing the things they did and they're not going to stay sober. So they have to go to meetings. They should get together with friends that are sober. They need to get a job. I do a class at the rehab I refer people to, and I can't tell you how many people at $45,000 a month say, I beg your pardon, what's the name of the class? I said, it's called the BBQ Class. And they go, $47,000 and I'm paying, and you're sending my kid to a barbecue class. I said, yes, I am sending your son to a barbecue class. And I'm going to tell you what we do in the class. He has 10 friends that he has a $150 budget that he's going to throw a barbecue with his friends, a sober barbecue. So we start walking down the aisle and I say, hey, Tommy, listen, you're going to have plastic forks and knives, and you're going to have paper plates. I would advise you get the cheaper stuff. So we go get that. And immediately his hand goes to take out the big thing of steaks. And I said, Tommy, those are $15 a piece. How are you going to buy 10 of those for all your friends? Remember, we only have $150 to throw this whole barbecue. So we go back and we start looking at how good the hot dogs and the hamburgers are starting to look with the budget that we have. And at the end of the day, we spend the entire 2 hours knocking that number down until it's down to zero, and we come in under budget. And then we go back to the rehab, and we have 10 of his friends have a barbecue. And when the barbecue's all done and they realize that they could play music, hang out, cook food, throw a football around, do whatever they're going to do, and stay sober and actually laugh and have a good time, I said, hey, Tom, can I see you for a minute? Now remember, Tommy's 20 years old. He's been in rehab now for a year, and he's about to leave. And when he leaves, mom and dad aren't taking him back. He's already stolen the car, ended up in jail, assaulted his father. They've had him. I said, let's take that list out again. So what was the most expensive item on that list, Tommy? He said, well, the meat was the most expensive. I said, that's your rent. These kids have never balanced a checkbook before in their lives. They've never lived on their own and had to pay their bills before. What's the second most expensive thing? Was the cutlery, the plates, the spoons, the forks, the cups, everything. That's your cell phone bill. You're going to work in the grocery store. I'm going to get you a job, and I'm going to place you in a job that's going to pay you $650 a week. You're going to times that by 4. And before you go out to sushi with your friends, the first week you get the check and blow $150, you have to pay all of those bills. They don't know how to do that. They've never done it before because we as parents have spoiled them rotten and didn't get treated the way we did when we were younger and have to go out and actually have a job. And I'm not pointing any fingers. I'm looking right at myself when I say this. I'm looking right at myself about how I raised my first 3 kids. I handed it to them on a silver platter and did not teach them some of the fundamental things that were taught to me. I'm guilty of it. But when you turn around and you complicate that with being an addict, remember that every emotional and mental growth from the time they started their addiction ceased. So you take this 20-year-old kid who has the emotional IQ of a 14 or 15-year-old, and he has the mental IQ as far as life experiences of a 14 or 15-year-old, and throw him out into the real world, guess what? He's a candidate for my barbecue class, because there are greater lessons behind that door than seem to be when you look at it before you open it and step in and figure out what it is I'm really doing. I can't say that I know exactly what it is that we're supposed to do to help these kids right now. I was speaking at an organization called HEAL in Auburn, New York. And it's Heroin Emergency something league. They asked me, well, will you build or help us build a rehab here in Auburn? And I said, you don't need a rehab. You need a pizza place. And of course, they looked up at me and said, listen, getting sober is not the hard thing. Staying sober is the hard thing. Learning to live your life and be able to walk away from those warning signs and those people, places, and things that are triggers for you to go back and use is the hard part. The reason you have a pizza place is because in the back, you make the coffee for free, They smoke 100 cigarettes an hour, and they get to meet as a group with other young men and women as a safe place to go and talk about, I can't stand my mother, she's such a pain in the ass, and I blah, blah. Whatever it is, it's a place that they do that with each other and not with other addicts that aren't sober, that cause them to go back on the needle. So you also have a storefront and pizzas to make and deliver and start working and do things together. So I've several times now opened up meeting houses where the kids just go for free. All of the sober recovery centers that I send people to, all of them started with a place to go hang out first. We just gave it to them. Come on down, we'll have meetings. We supplied the coffee, we supplied the waters and everything else, put a pool table in, and just let them have a place to go. There's not a lot of places for them to go. And in Ithaca, God bless the mayor of Ithaca, because his answer was to give them shooting centers. So there's safe havens for addicts to go to, our kids, to sit in a room, because there's a nurse in the facility, and shoot heroin. And we want to make sure you don't die in some hotel room. So we're going to let you come. Our tax dollars in the state of New York are paying for kids to have a safe place to go shoot. But I can't get them to put up a 10-bed facility to give you a chance to come off of heroin and do something about it there. I don't know, guys. Maybe I'm too old school, but that sounds like craziness to me. That sounds like crazy. That sounds like an invitation. That sounds like putting a house of prostitution over here in one of these stores and saying, you know what, we don't want you to get AIDS, so come on in here and have sex with random people. We're okay with that. And you know, and I don't want to preach religion, but where is the presence of God in that? Where is the presence of God or a higher power in that philosophy? I don't see it. I don't see it. So I'm not 100% sure what to do except for keep showing up at people's living rooms, which tomorrow my wife and I are going to drive down to Long Island. And, you know, I set the trap on this kid. I let him tell me, friend of mine since I'm 5 years old, her son. And I'm going to go take him and I'm going to put him in rehab because he's spinning out of control. Just got caught stealing $3,000 worth of checks from his father, who's bedridden and paralyzed and blah, 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 blah. So I'm wide open to questions though, so have at it. Don't jump at once, please. Yes, back in row 59. Anybody? Yes.
Do you agree with the parents who shut their house and shut off the kids? Kind of, you know, I'm done with you type thing? I mean, I see it both ways.
So the question is, do you agree with the parent that shuts the child out and says, I'm done with you? Well, so I'll tell you this, you can love your child to death. You can love your spouse to death with this disease, you really can. You can love an alcoholic to death, no question. So there's a line, you know, and it has to do with repetition and how long, and there's a lot of factors involved. But I will say this, you can enable somebody to death way more. You know, the access to money, the access to, now I'm not saying that you take a 15-year-old that has a drug problem and throw him to the wolves. But you do give them options. You know, let's take the stereotypical, your husband's an alcoholic or your husband's a drug addict. And it's been how many times it's affecting the kids, it's affecting you. You know, the family is sick when it comes to the addiction cycle. It's not just the addict. The whole family is sick and corrupted, and you've done things and said things that you didn't mean, and you've also allowed things that you wouldn't allow anyone else to do to your kids, but you allow the schmuck that happens to be your husband to do it. So, you know, we all play a role in it, but the family is sick. So for those people who don't go into some form of recovery for themselves, like Al-Anon or Alateen or seek counseling or whatever, you're making a mistake because you're definitely affected by the disease and you're sick. But I would have to say that I'm more old school, where I've gone into more interventions and I've had the mother, unbeknownst to the kid, pack his bag and leave it out on the front lawn. And I've said, well, if you're not coming with me, your bag's out there, you're not coming back in the house. But you gotta have the support of both parents to do that with a kid. So when you finally, and the kid might say, fine, I'm taking my bag. And he goes down to his friend's house for 2 days. But he calls his mother crying like he was 4 years old. Within a couple of days, he goes, what do you want me to do? And then I come back, I get him, and I put him in rehab. So, you know, the old adage of a guy has to really want to get sober is total BS. He doesn't have to want to be sober. He doesn't even know he needs to be sober on some of these drugs now. So when you take a kid, and it's the old barbershop thing. Hang out in the barbershop long enough, you're bound to get a haircut. Except you, sir. You will not get a haircut in the barbershop. But you will. I take them to rehab, and I put them in rehab, and let them catch the miracle. It might be a couple of weeks, but you usually get that lucid thing that happens when neurons start firing properly again, and they go, you know what? This is definitely better than what I was doing. This is definitely a lot better. I'm eating, I'm sleeping, I feel better about myself. And the other thing too is, remember that somebody that's addicted to a substance, there's an underlying reason usually, probably over 90% of the time. So many times what you find in day 65, a breakthrough happens in therapy where the girl says, I was molested, or the boy says, I was touched inappropriately, or there was a death in the family, or something that affected them way more than you even knew. And so that underlying reason is what fuels the secondary or the byproduct, which is the addiction. If you're not in there long enough with a therapist that you're going to trust, and that doesn't happen in 28 days. It doesn't happen to a young girl in 28 days. She hasn't even told her mother yet, or her mother would have told us that this was something we needed to work on. So this takes months for someone to get underneath and peel that onion back that far. That's why they have to stay for 6 months to a year to really truly exercise this demon, process it properly, and flush it out so that they're okay with it. And they never have to go back to the drug or alcohol in order to avoid the feeling that it brings upon them. Anyone else?
How do you get through to the schools that, like you said, the one who's denying there's any problem? There's so many schools that don't see the things that happen before the drugs, like the sexual assaults, like the suicides, like all of this stuff that's happening in the school.
Yes. So the question was, how do you get through to the school? I learned 3 words that gets the school's attention really, really fast. I'll sue you. As jarring as that sounds, it's the greatest dread that they have in the district. So if you suspect that there's a problem, call up, identify the problem, and say, and I want it attended to immediately, or I'm contacting my lawyer, I'll sue you. And watch, a full-scale investigation takes place immediately. Every kid is down at the principal's office, detention office, and they figure it all out, and then they report back to you. It's when you don't threaten that to the district that they get lackadaisical and they want to cover it up because they don't want to face up to the fact. And listen, I can understand them. Both my parents were educators. I can understand why they don't want to have to look at that. There's a budget, they're elected, many of them, they don't want to have to face up. But if they really were willing, we have a guy in my kid's district, Tommy Calabufo, who he's the man, He's a warrior. He's in the trenches. He's the first one to call you up and say, hey, we had a situation. Please come down. They want the parents. They want everybody in a room. And I love this guy because he's not afraid. I've got some other people in the same district who are just, they're bean counters. They want to get them in, get them out. They corral them like they're sheep. They really don't care, or it doesn't appear that they do. But no, this guy, this superintendent, he's the man. I love this guy. But yes, I'd threaten them. I would. Anybody else? Anybody else with some great threatening advice I can give you?
How do we duplicate you?
Ha! That would be scary. Talk to my wife. How do we duplicate you? Well, I've got 3 brothers. We all look alike, and I'll tell you a great story about the first time I ever did, and I'm going to end on this note, this really funny story. So I'm going to do the Tonight Show for the first time. It's a big thing in your career when you're going to do Leno, Letterman, or any of these guys. I'm doing a big TV series, and so they interview you beforehand, and then you walk out on the stage. Now, 2 nights in a row, I dreamed very vividly that I was going to trip and fall in front of Jay Leno as I'm walking out. I fell right on my face. So when I walked out, and my first guest is Daniel Baldwin, and I walked out like this. And I literally was pounding my feet down. And I walked up to Leno, and the only time you have alone with Kimmel, Leno, Letterman, or any of them is when they come out from behind their desk, and hopefully the audience is still clapping as you shake hands with them. And Jay said, Daniel, thanks for doing the show. I said, Jay, thanks for having me on. And as soon as I said thanks for having me on, the audience got quiet. And Leno put his hands like this and he said, you know, you boys look so much alike from here to here. And you sound so much alike. To what do you attribute that to? And I didn't miss a beat. I said, Jay, my mother and father were boring lovers. They did it in the same position all the time. I got a great laugh until I got home and got the message from my mother.
Ooh.
I told women from my church group to watch that show, you animal. How dare you talk about your father and me having sex on national television? Don't call this. My mother didn't talk to me for a month. I'm calling, begging, Mom, I'm sorry, it was just a joke. Nothing. Then finally she needed something and she called me. Well, thank you for taking the time to listen to me banter, and I want to give this out to you. Every single person in front of me right now knows someone or a family or somebody that has struggled with this problem. I live in Syracuse. I drove here. I'm driving all the way out to the eastern tip of Long Island tomorrow. As soon as I get my kids on the bus, someone's going to come pick up my kids from school so I can go service this kid, completely free of charge. BaldwinHelp@iCloud.com. BaldwinHelp@iCloud.com is my email. If you have a friend, a family member, somebody that you know that's suffering from an addiction problem, you email me directly. I will call you with the number that you had, and I will show up in your living room to get this person help. I promise. Thank you.
Woo!